This is Steve Zeltzer with KPFA Workweek Radio, and I'm with Victor Grossman. Welcome to Workweek. Victor, why don't you talk about your life and how you ended up in East Germany?
Well, I was a red diaper baby. I grew up in New York at the end of the 1930s. I was born in 1928, when it was a pretty left-wing time and a pretty left-wing area which I lived in, and people we knew. And I quickly became a leftist and stayed that way. In high school, I went to several schools, and then in college, which is where I was recruited into the Communist Party. And after college, I responded to an appeal by the party and went into work in a factory, actually in two factories, until I got drafted during the Korean War. I was just too young to get drafted for the Second World War, but I got caught up by the Korean War. I had luck that I was sent not to Korea but to West Germany. But I had bad luck because when you were drafted in those days, you had to sign a statement that you'd never been in any left-wing organization. And I had been in a dozen of them, the youth organizations and the party. And but if I signed that I had been, if I admitted that I had been, there was a law called the McCarran Act, which said anybody in any of these organizations must report immediately to the police as a foreign agent. Otherwise, he can be punished up to $10,000 and 5 years in jail per day that he doesn't report. It means after a week it's 35 years. And there's already 6 months gone by. In any case, I was scared when I was drafted, and therefore I signed this statement that I hadn't been, lying, in other words, and hoping that nobody would catch up on me. And for a long time it worked, but then they did catch up on me. Somebody denounced me. That may have been the reason. While I was in West Germany, I get this report from the Pentagon saying, you were in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Report to the military judge next Monday. And for having lied, there was a somewhat similar penalty, not per day, but a one-time penalty up to 5 years. And that's why I decided, not that I wanted to defect, but
you were kind of forced into it. You didn't want to. You didn't want to go.
I was scared. I was panicked. I did not want to spend any time in a military prison, and therefore I figured out the safest way to get across, which was probably the unsafest. And I went to Austria and swam across the Danube River from the American to the Soviet zone, and they sent me to East Germany.
And you got to East Germany. What was it like here at that time?
That was in 1952 already. I was 24. And it was only 7, 8 years after the war. Things were pretty tight here, but not as I was possibly ready to expect. I didn't see any hunger or people going hungry or ragged, but the stores were not well stocked. It was pretty tight, but there was enough to eat for people. I worked for a while in a factory, then I learned to be a lathe operator, and then I was able to go to college again, starting all over again, 4 more years.
Where did you go to college?
I'm the only person in the world who has a diploma from both Harvard University and the Karl-Marx University of Leipzig. And I'm going to remain that because it's no longer called that. So I'm going to have
changed the name.
That's right. So I'll have that honor alone. In any case, life was not easy, especially in that first year, and especially for me in a room which had a special oven you had to heat up, which I never really learned to do properly, and no running water, and not even flush toilets. But gradually, over the years, my life improved, as did the life of most people. And then when I went to Leipzig, already I moved upwards, and that's when I went with my future wife, whom I met in the first year, luckily. That's what saved me from homesickness, basically, that I luckily found her within a few months, and she went with me to Leipzig. She got a job there, and we got married then, and as a sublet, we had subletting. And then after 4 years at college, I moved to East Berlin. At first also I didn't have an apartment, but then after a year I got an apartment, and she came from Leipzig with our son then, our little son. And after 2 more years, we got this present apartment, and I've been in it 1961. I've been in it ever since. I'm in this. It was newly built then. It was with central heating, with all the sanitary. It was a modern apartment, and we were quite happy here.
So the East Germany has always been portrayed in the United States and the capitals as a terrible place. People did not want to be there. People wanted to escape. It wasn't a place that really people wanted to be, but they were forced to be there.
Yeah, it's a mixed story because, of course, a lot of people were not happy. There are a lot of people who dreamed of the glorious West because in television, which we got every evening from the West, if you wanted, and most people did, we saw this wonderful life in the West. I don't know how many people remember this series called Dallas, about these oil barons in Texas and their wonderful lives. An awful lot of people in East Germany, the GDR as we call it, thought that's how people live in the United States, and they wanted to live that way too. And since the East Germany was disadvantaged from the start, first of all, it was much smaller than West Germany. Second of all, it had none of the natural resources which West Germany did. It had almost no natural resources except a very low-grade quality coal, which was ecologically terrible. And not only that, but most of the experts in management and research and industry in general, in 1945, when they saw the Russians coming and the German Reds coming back, they took off for the West and got jobs with the same big old companies in West Germany, which were thrown out of East Germany, which meant that they had to start here in many ways from below zero, in a very, very difficult condition. Not only that, West Germany got Marshall Plan help from the United States, millions and millions, whereas East Germany paid almost the entire war reparations, 95% to Russia or the Soviets and to Poland. So that in many ways it was behind. Therefore, it could never catch up with consumer good level in West Germany. But it did manage to, first of all, there was always enough for people to eat basically all they wanted, to put on as many clothes as they wanted, well, you had so many advantages. You had all medical care was covered, all education was free. I and my two sons went to college for nothing and got 200 marks a month, which covered basic expenses. As I say, medical care, including having both babies and a long maternity leave that my wife had before and after,
those things you don't have in the United States right now.
No, I know that it's still a fight. It's still a fight, yes.
I mean, there are millions of people without health care in the United States.
No, at the beginning it wasn't quite so much for my first son, but with my second son already, women had 6 months leave paid, and 6 months unpaid, but their job was guaranteed. And if they had more than 2 children, it was more. Plus, much more vacation, basically 3 weeks or more for almost everybody. And not only that, but free child care. It cost nothing. You could leave your child as of 1 year old if you wanted, up to kindergarten age, and then you went to school. This was also free. Women were paid equal wages. They got, interestingly enough, women and later men too, if they had their own household, got 1 day off free a month paid, called a household day. And vacations were so cheap. Summer vacations for children were basically free. It was a small expense. But it could never catch up with West German commodity level. In other words, the most modern styles, the fashionable styles, and certain foods, especially those imported from tropical areas. There were never bananas. There were rarely oranges. There was not the variety that they would have in West Germany. And people saw this with big envious eyes. Also, cars. They made cars here, but they were little 2-stroke cars called Trabant. I had 4 of them. It was okay for me, but a lot of people, including my wife, were not so happy with it. It was good because you didn't have to put oil in it. The oil was in the gas already, and you didn't have to put water in it because it was air cooled. And it was, you went so far in a gallon, but you couldn't go too fast. At about 65, 70 was the limit. In fact, there was a joke then: how much faster can a Trabant go over 70? And the answer was, it depends on how high you drop it from. There were always jokes about it. At the same time, people were jealous. And not only that, because there were all kinds of attempts to destroy the East Germany, the GDR, from West Germany. They never forgave the big companies like Siemens, Bayer, the Deutsche Bank, the big auto companies. They never forgave the GDR for throwing them out completely and taking over what they had there. And they always wanted to smash that, to take it back. And so they were constantly working to undermine the country. Because of that, there was in opposing that, there was repression because people were frightened. The government was frightened of just that happening, that they were being taken over, which is what happened in the end. And therefore, many people were unhappy because there was a very widespread net of what in the United States would be called FBI, but in East Germany was called Stasi. And
neighbors spying on neighbors?
Meaning that too. This got many people worried and angry. With me, a little bit less so, because I had known that I was being spied on when I was in the United States. I'll never forget, I was in a sublet room. I lifted the phone. The person on the other end thought it was the landlord and said, "This is the FBI." And as he heard that it was my voice, he quickly stopped. Obviously, they were following me. And later, Freedom of Information Act, I got 1,100 pages about me. So that my answer about Stasi is, they all do it, every country.
And during the witch hunts, the FBI was going after people, spying on people. I mean, thousands of people.
And in fact, earlier too. And since there was an FBI, basically, and J. Edgar Hoover, the head of it, they were always spying on people.
And the Palmer raids, of course, in
right, that started it off in a way. Well, in a certain way. In any case, however, it did mean that many people were not happy here. They wanted to go to the West, where they thought they'd have a good life, a better life, and many of them did. Some of them didn't, but many of them did. And not only that, but people, especially young people, took for granted there's things like free education, complete medical care. West Germany was much better than the United States in that sense too. So it wasn't such a big difference. They had to. They had to, because there was a certain rivalry.
They were competing with what was
That's right.
danger.
So they had to have and not only, in many ways, they had to keep up, but they were never as good as the GDR in terms of conditions at work for safety, and the fact that there was a saying, and this perhaps sums up the spirit a little. There was a saying after the end of East Germany, in factories, it was sometimes said, in the old days when it was still East Germany, if you were smart, you didn't say anything against the party leadership, that was Honecker, or the other big shots up on top. If you were smart, you didn't, at least not among your friends and so forth, but otherwise you wouldn't. But you could say anything you wanted about the foreman or the manager because they couldn't fire you, which is true. People were never fired. They had to. Now they said things have changed. It's the other way around. You could say anything you want about the politicians on top, but you better not say anything against the foreman or the manager, or you'll lose your job. This is an interesting balance. Which is more important and which is worse?
Now, the Berlin Wall, this is the 30th anniversary of its end. Did you think that this was going to happen?
In the last years, that means in the middle of the 80s, 1980s, you could see that things were going downhill here. you could see economically. Up until then, from the time I arrived in the 1950s until the middle of the 80s, living standards went up and up and up for most people. Not evenly, some groups more quickly than others, but they were going up in general for everybody. This meant that almost every year on holidays, the newspapers were full, 3-4 pages full of which prices are going down, because they were the prices were national basis. But middle of the 80s, things got tougher, partly because East Germany felt it necessary to keep as well armed as possible. West Germany was very modern, the most modern armaments. It forced Germany to arm itself to death, was the term then. Second of all, it could not keep up with the electronics development, which was so important in those years, because the Soviets could not help. They were busy with their own. And West Germany was not allowed, or Western Europe, or the West in general, did not supply East Germany with anything. It meant that this little country had to try to catch up with IBM and Sony, and it couldn't. But it cost billions. And the third thing was, there was a giant housing development program to give everybody in the country a modern apartment by 1990, and that cost billions. And those three perhaps broke the back economically.
One of the things in Russia, or the Soviet Union at that time, was the fear of communication copy machines had to be registered, and people could not copy stuff. It was there efforts to prevent people from communicating through these new technologies, which at that time was new, copy machines?
Yeah, they were. There were. It was not easy to get to a copy machine. They didn't have these modern, what was Xerox in those days. That was just beginning at that time. But no, the government was really afraid of any organized movement against it. Any group that was organizing against it, and there were many groups organizing against it, they found various ways of getting past it. But the government kept on trying to stop that, to save itself, to save the country. In the end, it didn't succeed.
And of course, if you prevent communication communication technology, you're harming the development of your economy.
Yes.
As far as the introduction of new technology.
Well, of course, the social media were just beginning at that time, 30 years ago. They didn't, even technically, they weren't up to it. Fax was hardly known. It was just beginning, so that it was not quite the difference that it would make today. But it's true. And the media were really controlled, so that you didn't, on the one hand, the media stuck to the official line. On the other hand, what people in the West do not realize is, it's not that people were going around scared all the time. People didn't give a damn. They didn't like the newspaper because it was just the same old stuff. They read the headlines, the local news, the sports news, and the obituaries, and the rest they didn't bother with. And the same basically with television. They saw what they liked. They turned off what they didn't like, or they turned to Western TV and chose between them. People were not worried about this. They talked very freely among themselves, in fact, on every level, except at a meeting or in a school class. You tended not to attack the government policies.
Well, were you in the Communist Party at that time?
No, there was the equivalent called the Socialist Unity Party. No, I never did join it.
And do you know if there was any debate or what was going on in the party?
Yes, in the party, because many of my friends were in it. It was not that I was not involved. It's just that I was not a member. I didn't go to the membership meetings. But yes, this is where the discussions were often quite interesting. This depended on the group. In other words, at universities there's a much more discussion than in some local neighborhood. But at these meetings, people's ideas and also their criticism was spoken more than any place else, and this went up to the top, so that they sort of, in this way, kept an idea of what people were saying and thinking about to a great degree, even though it was not reflected in the press. And how they should have done it differently is a difficult question, because every time that a newspaper had anything which was even a little bit critical, it was immediately picked up in the Western TV, magnified, often distorted, and broadcast back into East Germany for the people, so that the tendency was have nothing critical because it can be used against us. And this was because most people in East Germany, or an awful lot of people, had relatives in the West. Brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, etc. So there was a constant communication. And since West Germany was constantly trying to undermine East Germany, there was a real, you would say, paranoia, except that with paranoia, it's imagined often. It was not imagined. There was really a threat, which in the end won out. But they just never quite found the proper way to answer it. There was some good attempts. We had wonderful theater. We had wonderful films. We had wonderful books. We had wonderful clubs of all kinds. But when it got to criticism, that's where you kept it in private circles or among your friends. There you talked openly, but not publicly.
Now,
I'm not sure.
What?
They're the only one not sure.
Okay.
And,
so the Gorbachev and the leaders of the Communist Party in Russia believed that if they transformed the country, it would be more like Sweden or Denmark, a social democracy. Was that the same idea here? What did people in East Germany think about what was going on in Russia, the Soviet Union?
In those years, that was in the middle, a little past the middle of the 1980s, when things were going downhill here. And so many people were very enthusiastic about Gorbachev, but many were not, including me. I was enthusiastic at the beginning because he really spoke up for peace, which was the most important issue for us at the time, and still is today, in my view. But he was talking big about new programs economically, but not achieving much, as I saw on a vacation in Sochi. There were lots of hurrah for this new ideas, but the stores were empty. In the GDR, that was not the case. We always had enough. We always had more than enough to eat and to clothe and everything. If not, as I say, if not always the most modern and fashionable stuff, that you had to run to get that. And it was a constant running to try and find a store where you could still get some new fashionable item because people had money here. The majority of people had money because production could never keep up with this demand. People earned well. I'm not saying everybody, but a large number earned well, and rents were about 1/10 of your income, and car fare. The city car fare or train fare was almost free. And since college and medicine was all free, it meant that people had money to buy things.
So disposable income was growing.
Yes, exactly. But they could never catch up with demand on it. And this was a constant problem. And then, too, Gorbachev's ideas of glasnost, which meant transparency, of having free press. Of course, people liked that idea. But some people saw that what it meant with Gorbachev was that the people who really hated the Soviet Union, who lived there, took over the press to a great degree and caused its downfall. And that people who did not want to see the East Germany go down, they were skeptical about it.
Now, after the collapse of Russia, the people that owned apartments were provided those apartments. They didn't take them away. What happened to property in East Germany for the people here in East Germany?
Well, the first thing that happened was that the entire industry was destroyed. It's over 90%. This means that all the factories, almost all of them, were closed down.
Who closed them down?
This included the factories which they were talking about in the West, which were old-fashioned and broken down, decrepit, but also very modern new factories, important steel mills and big factories. They was all closed down. It was closed down by agreement with the West German government. They said in this trustee board, which took over every publicly owned industry in the country, and they sold it often for a song.
A pittance.
Yes, to people they call in German for an apple and an egg, for almost nothing, to people who took any good machinery out, sold that, and let the rest of the thing go to hell. And so you saw ruined buildings all over the country. Not only that, they threw out a huge proportion of people in teaching college, the professors, journalism, administration, the courts, in every field, they threw people, almost either threw them out or downgraded them under the rule of somebody coming in from the West who got a privilege bonus for coming here. And this meant a terrible time in those first years, which is still going on. We're still well behind.
And have the right wing, the fascist movement, used that feeling that East Germans have been taken advantage of?
Very definitely. You see, the main feature of East Germany, or as I call it, the GDR, German Democratic Republic, which made me appreciate it was anti-Nazi from the start. That was the whole basis, which was different from West Germany, where the Nazis, except for the very top level, they basically took over. People don't know that, but
they came to the United States.
Some of them came to like the famous one, Brown, but they took over in every field. In the GDR, they were almost all of them thrown out of any position, including from schools, teachers, judges, police. They were all thrown out, and I liked that. But, of course, you couldn't change everybody's mind in 2 generations. And the ones who had been still with fascist and racist ideas, they kept their mouths shut. I found that very good. But after the change, they suddenly came out of the woodwork. And not only that, but a lot of people came over from West Germany who took advantage of the fact that you had hundreds of thousands of young people who had, up until then, in GDR days, had a future secure. They knew that they went to trade school or college, but most people went to trade school, learned a trade, and were guaranteed a job at the same wage as the older people. This was no longer. So you had thousands of young people who had nothing to do, had no hope, had no orientation, because everything they'd learned until then was suddenly considered wrong. And the Nazis came in from West Germany or out of the woodwork in the East, and they took advantage of these young people who had no place to go and who were sad and sour and angry and disappointed, not only young people, but especially young people. And they have now become a very, very great menace, which reminds some people like me more and more of the years just before Hitler took over. And we have a few people here who are speaking in the same way that Hitler did.
And migrants and immigrants, what is the situation? Has that been used in this Germany to blame them for the crisis, the economic problems and other crises?
It's very much like, I think, like the situation in parts of the United States where the immigrants or the people from Mexico or Central America are blamed for problems of joblessness. The same here. The people who had no jobs or who had it rough, and many did have it rough, because a lot of that protection of workers' rights in the factories was gone. They worked more hours. They had to come in weekends, whether they wanted to or not. It was speed up.
And this was the capitalist agenda.
And most of all, there was an increase of these temporary jobs, these unpaid jobs, low-paid jobs, the ones where you don't have a contract, where you try to get along somehow. And people in these situations with no job or with bad jobs or with insecure futures, or who maybe were okay but didn't know what would happen with their kids, they were told by the fascists, but also by the media. It was hinted by the media. It wasn't said. It's the fault of all these refugees and immigrants from Africa or from Near East. They're getting all the privileges and all the money that should be going to you. And this was done so cleverly that a lot of people believed it, and those are the ones who vote for this fascist party, which has become so strong in East Germany, especially strong. In fact, in West Germany, well, nationally it's about 13, 14% now, but in East Germany, up to 25% vote for this fascist party. It's really frightening.
And the other left party, major left party, Die Linke, what is that?
The Linke party, that means the left, was partly the leftovers from the old Communist Party here. Most people left after the end of the GDR because they had hoped in that party to have perks and to have privileges. This was gone. It was only people who really believed in an ideal of socialism who stayed in it. But some did, and the votes went up to 16%, 20% sometimes even more, who kept to these ideas or remained in the party. Then in 2007, they were joined by a West German left-wing party who were dissatisfied because the Social Democratic Party, as it's called there, it's sort of something like the Democrats in the United States in general. They were dissatisfied that they weren't militant enough, weren't fighting enough, and also trade unionists who were not found the unions weren't militant enough. They joined together. It became an East-West party, the Linke, which takes, I find, by the way, I'm a member of that, I find takes very, very good positions on almost everything, especially it's the only party which is really against war and against building up a huge military and looking for peace, but it's also for the rights of working people. However, it has not been able to, especially in the East, to capture enough of the people's ideas to stay in, to get very strong. So that it's now, on a national level, it gets about 9-10% of the vote. In the East, well, in one state it won out. It had 23% just recently. But it needs to have a militant position, and in Berlin now, it's taken a militant position to stop all rent increases for 5 years, because Berlin is hit hard by rents going up and up and up and up.
Gentrification and
people
private
are forced out by so-called modernization, and there's no place for them to go. And this new law, which is just being processed right now, should start in February, would stop rent increases. And this is supported by three parties, by the Greens, which are not so left as in the United States.
They supported the invasion of, or the attack on Serbia and the war.
The Greens are not like the Greens in the United States. They're not really a left-wing party. They're very strong on environment, but they vary. And in Berlin, they and also the Social Democrats have gone along with the left in saying it's impossible to go any further with people being forced out of all their homes, especially in the whole central, and being forced into the outskirts if they can find anything. And therefore, they have a coalition, all three together in Berlin. What will happen to that? We'll have to wait and see.
Now, the issue of temporary workers, the gig economy, how capitalism is exploiting workers so that they don't have any regular jobs. Here, if you have a temporary job, you're not even necessarily going to get pension. You're not in the pension system. Is that is that a real problem in Germany?
Pensions are a big problem, and an awful lot of people have no real hope for enough pension money to get along, because most pensions are on state basis. There's not so much of this from your place of work. Some people got that, but it's mostly on the basis of you pay all your working life, you pay into the pension fund. But for people who for 30 years didn't have good jobs, their pensions are not going to be very good.
So you must have a lot of angry people then, if your real income is declining.
And now the governing parties, that's the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, are trying to say we're improving that. They're making small improvements, but they're not big improvements. And this question is still very hot and very worrisome, because you have an awful lot of elderly people who have a very, very hard time getting along.
And the developments in the United States, this upcoming election may be the debate between socialism and capitalism. Majority of young people in the United States look to socialism as a solution for their crisis, the lack of their indebtedness for going to college, their lack of getting jobs. What do you think the political developments in the United States, if it moves to the left, would be in Germany?
What will it be in Germany?
What would the political impact be of a movement in the left in the United States?
Oh. Well, if Bernie Sanders should win the election, which is, I don't know what the odds are. They're not so...
A long shot.
Yeah, it's a long shot. This would change the whole picture of the United States completely in the world today. Otherwise, with Trump is not popular here, but I think a lot of people are confused about the role of the Democratic Party, because some people say it's pretty much the same as the Republicans, others say that it isn't. They're not so clear on that. I think that Germany is split in some ways, including in government, whether to go along with the United States internationally, which means in terms of military pushing ahead.
Surrounding Russia,
Exactly.
having troops in Ukraine,
Exactly.
supporting Nazis in the Ukraine?
This is exactly the question is, should we go along with the United States in trying to isolate Russia, surround it with Ukraine, Georgia, Poland, Estonia maneuvers, or instead should we try to follow a policy of getting along, not agreeing with Russia on everything, but trading and being diplomatic and talking with them and working with them? The government is split because you have some people or some companies who profit from selling, say, cars to Russia. Others profit from making armaments.
Well, what was the effect of Trump telling the Germans that they should not buy gas from Russia?
Well, that didn't go over with anybody. It didn't go over with Merkel on the top either. Nobody likes the idea of having the United States come in and tell them what to do. Some are willing to accept the United States telling them they should increase their armaments. Some people like that. Some people in the government like it, including the new head of the European Union, who comes from Germany. She liked the idea of building military, building up armies, especially aggressive ones, with drones and with all kinds. Other people say, no, that's not going to help us economically, and it's a danger of war. We should be trying to get together with them and with the Russians, and in general, to tone down atomic weapons especially, and drones, and to work against this. And most Germans, the majority of the German people, also would prefer a peaceful policy. In the government level, as I say, they're split. But it's only this left party which really has a consistent policy of not finding enemies to the east, but trying to get along in the world and to cut back on armaments.
And this growing inter-imperialist rivalry between the United States, Europe, China, this is threatening trade wars. It's threatening growing potential real war, global war. Are you concerned about a world war?
Very much so. Of course, the question for Germany is, should it become the junior partner for those people in the United States? I won't name them. And in Colombia, who would ever have thought it? And in Iraq, and in Sudan, but also, unfortunately, in Bolivia. And
the United States was involved in that. I mean,
of course it was. Of course it was. It's a difficult fight, and the question is not to look at this as a fight between America and other countries, because within the United States, the same people who want to make trouble in the world, to get stronger and stronger, to build up American military strength, are also hurting the people in the United States. That money should be going to good things: schools, roads, hospitals, etc., and healthcare, and not to billions and billions and billions and billions going to armaments.
The militarization, I mean, the amount of money that the United States spends, military-industrial complex, this is the history of the United States, but also this idea of American exceptionalism, that America is bringing democracy around the world.
Yes, unfortunately, and I've done some work on this. In fact, It's in my book, which I've written. Book is called A Socialist Defector, From Harvard to Karl-Marx-Allee, if anybody's interested. I tried to show, first of all, how in the United States these fights have been going on, the real genuine United States, and I consider myself a patriot, an American patriot, but I look to the real good America, the people like John Brown or Harriet Tubman, and the fighters in the 1930s CIO building, and the ones like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and all the others who are fighting for good things in the United States. That's the true America. And we, people like me, also in Europe, are hoping that these forces, these people, are the ones who become stronger, and not the ones who say the United States has to control the world. That's bad for the world, and it's bad for the United States, and it's dangerous, because they all have atomic weapons now. It could be just some mistake, and the damn thing blows off, and then all the worries about ecology or about warm climate,
global warming, yeah.
they'd be unnecessary, because the whole damn world would be going up in flames in atomic disaster. And some people in Germany see that and do not want to be a junior partner for people like, say, Pompeo or Bolton. And some people do. We have the same problem here as in the United States, or today in England, or in so many countries. This same kind of problem, and can only hope that the so-called little people, they're not little, but the so-called little people, the people who do the work, manage to break through against these people who are sticking billions and billions and billions into their islands, Cayman Islands or other spots, or into their one big yacht after the other, one big skyscraper or a mansion after the other. That's where all that money is going to. And instead of going to the people who need it and who turn to things like opioids to save themselves, it's a pretty sad business we see. Opioids haven't hit here yet, but they could.
And they make a profit from murdering people.
Exactly.
People were dying because of their need for profits.
This family earned $13 billion from
Sackler
substance which has caused hundreds of thousands to suffer and die.
That's capitalism.
Yeah. Well, we got rid of it. And in 1945, not we, I wasn't here yet, I didn't get here till 52, but they got rid of it in 45 in East Germany, and tried to do something with it, and succeeded basically in getting rid of poverty. But they could not catch up with the West. It's something like I say, in the World Series, the Washington team won out. Was it because it was more moral or better? It was stronger. In this case, the capitalist group that was called the West was stronger than the East. The East made a lot of blunders. After all, it was something new, relatively new in the world. They made a lot of blunders. They did a lot of bad things too, a lot of hard things which chased people. But basically, the goal was to have a country where nobody is in need, no one's in poverty, everybody has their teeth fixed, their health taken care of, even if it's heart or cancer. They can go to college if they're up to it. All these things. This is something we were trying to get and achieve to a degree, but in the end, we're beaten by the forces of big money.